The telephone line crackled with static as Adolf Hitler's voice rose to a scream that could be heard even by officers standing several meters away from the receiver. It was January 1945, and Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner stood in his command post in Silesia, the handset held slightly away from his ear, his face carefully neutral, as the Führer demanded to know why Army Group Center had withdrawn from positions Hitler had explicitly ordered held to the last man. Around Schörner, staff officers bent over their maps with studied concentration, pretending not to hear the tirade echoing through the room, each man acutely aware that they were witnessing something that had been happening with increasing frequency across all fronts. Hitler's orders were being ignored. Not openly defied, that would be suicidal in a regime where the SS and Gestapo still functioned with terrifying efficiency. Not formally disobeyed in ways that could be documented and prosecuted, but quietly, systematically, creatively reinterpreted by commanders who understood that following Hitler's directives literally would result in the pointless destruction of their forces. The gap between what Hitler commanded and what actually happened on the ground had been growing for months, and now, in the Reich's final winter, it had become a chasm that no amount of fury from the Führer bunker could bridge. Schörner was perhaps the wrong person for Hitler to be screaming at, because Schörner was one of the few senior commanders who actually tried to implement Hitler's insane orders, who hanged deserters and stragglers with enthusiastic brutality, who drove his men forward in attacks that accomplished nothing except to produce casualty lists. But even Schörner, even this fanatical Nazi loyalist, had been forced to authorize tactical withdrawals that contradicted Hitler's standing order that no ground would be surrendered without his personal authorization. The reality was simple. Soviet forces had broken through Army Group Center's lines, were threatening to encircle entire divisions, and staying in the positions Hitler demanded would have resulted in another Stalingrad. So Schörner's subordinates had pulled back, had saved their forces to fight another day, and had then reported the withdrawal to higher headquarters as a carefully worded message suggesting that enemy pressure had made the movement unavoidable, that communications difficulties had prevented requesting authorization in time, and that tactical flexibility had been essential to preserve combat power. This pattern had become standard operating procedure across the shrinking Reich. In the West, Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B was conducting fighting retreats across the Rhineland despite Hitler's orders to hold every town and village. In the East, General Gotthard Heinrici's forces were falling back before the Soviet juggernaut, trading space for time, ignoring directives to stand fast and die in place. In Italy, in Norway, in the isolated pockets of resistance across Eastern Europe, German commanders were making their own decisions based on military reality rather than ideological fantasy. Hitler had begun to suspect this systematic disobedience months earlier, but the full realization of its extent came gradually, like a patient discovering the progression of a terminal disease. The signs had been there for years, actually, going back to moments when generals had found ways to work around his most destructive impulses. But Hitler had always been able to tell himself that these were isolated incidents, exceptions that proved the general rule of obedience. By early 1945, even that self-deception had become impossible to maintain. The evidence was everywhere in the reports that reached the Führer bunker. Units that Hitler had ordered to hold positions were mysteriously appearing on maps dozens of kilometers to the rear, their commanders reporting that tactical adjustments had been necessary. Counteroffensives that Hitler demanded were being launched with far fewer forces than ordered, or were being called off after token efforts, with commanders citing ammunition shortages or enemy strength. Defensive lines that Hitler designated as absolutely critical were being abandoned, their defenders retreating before they could be encircled.
What made this realization particularly bitter for Hitler was that he had spent years creating mechanisms specifically designed to prevent such disobedience. He had removed independent-minded generals and replaced them with yes-men. He had created parallel command structures through the Waffen-SS that could enforce his will. He had stationed political officers and SS liaisons with military units to monitor ideological reliability. He had made examples of commanders who showed weakness, relieving them in disgrace, sometimes arresting them, occasionally executing them. Yet none of it was working anymore. The system he had built to ensure absolute obedience had broken down, not through open rebellion, but through 1,000 small acts of evasion and reinterpretation. Commanders were still formally respectful, still addressed him with proper deference, still began their reports with the required Nazi salutes and expressions of loyalty, but they were no longer actually following his orders when those orders contradicted basic military sense. General Heinrici, commanding the defense of Berlin's approaches, was perhaps the most skilled practitioner of this art of appearing to obey while actually doing something entirely different. When Hitler ordered him to hold specific positions regardless of cost, Heinrici would acknowledge the order formally, then immediately begin planning the fighting withdrawal that military reality demanded. When Hitler demanded counterattacks, Heinrici would launch limited spoiling attacks that technically fulfilled the order while preserving his forces from the suicidal, all-out assaults Hitler envisioned. Heinrici had learned this technique over years of service on the Eastern Front, where following Hitler's orders literally cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to no strategic purpose. He had watched Stalingrad, had seen how Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal turned a defeated army into a destroyed army. He had participated in operations where sensible tactical retreats could have saved divisions, but Hitler's stand-fast orders led to encirclement and annihilation. He had learned that a living army that retreated today could fight tomorrow, while a dead army that held its position achieved nothing except satisfying Hitler's ego. The technique required careful management. Heinrici and commanders like him had to maintain the fiction of obedience, had to frame their actions in language that suggested they were following the spirit of Hitler's orders, even when contradicting their letter. They developed a vocabulary of euphemisms, tactical adjustments instead of retreats, regrouping for counterattack instead of fleeing, consolidating positions instead of abandoning them. They became experts at exploiting the communications delays between front and headquarters, making decisions and then reporting them as accomplished facts that could not be reversed.
They also learned to manipulate the information flow to Hitler. Reports emphasized enemy strength and German casualties in ways that justified the actions they had already taken. They highlighted the tactical successes of withdrawals, forces saved, equipment preserved, while downplaying the strategic implications of surrendered territory. They became skilled at presenting Hitler with situations where his only choice was to approve what had already happened or to relieve commanders in the middle of a crisis, which would only make situations worse. Hitler, for his part, found himself trapped by the very system he had created. His entire command structure was designed to ensure that orders flowed downward without question. But this same structure made it nearly impossible for him to verify whether those orders were actually being executed. He was physically isolated in his bunker in Berlin, dependent on reports from subordinates who had every incentive to tell him what he wanted to hear while doing what they thought necessary. His personal interventions in tactical decisions, once effective when he could threaten or remove non-compliant commanders, had become counterproductive. The pool of competent generals willing to serve under his conditions had shrunk dramatically. The competent ones who remained had learned to evade his most destructive orders while maintaining the appearance of loyalty.
The truly fanatical loyalists like Schörner were capable of implementing his orders, but often lacked the military skill to use forces effectively. Moreover, the military situation had deteriorated to the point where Hitler's orders bore no relationship to what was actually possible. He demanded counteroffensives from armies that had barely enough fuel to retreat in good order. He ordered units to hold positions when they were already surrounded and out of ammunition. He spoke of reserve divisions that existed only on paper, of wonder weapons that remained in development, of political miracles that would split the Allied coalition. His grasp of reality had become so tenuous that obeying his orders literally would have accelerated Germany's collapse. Field Marshal Model, commanding in the West, embodied the tragic position of commanders caught between loyalty and reality. Model was a Nazi true believer, a skilled tactician, and a man of considerable moral courage. He wanted to obey Hitler, believed in the Nazi cause, and had demonstrated his loyalty through years of service. But he also had eyes to see what was happening. American and British forces were advancing with overwhelming material superiority. German units were dissolving under constant pressure. The Ruhr industrial region was being encircled. When Hitler ordered Model to hold the Ruhr at all costs, to turn it into a fortress that would tie down Allied forces, Model understood this was suicide. The Ruhr would be surrounded, its defenders would be starved of supplies, and the industrial facilities Hitler wanted preserved would be destroyed in the fighting anyway. But refusing the order directly was impossible. So Model implemented it partially, establishing defensive positions while quietly allowing forces to slip out of the pocket before it closed, preserving some combat power while appearing to follow directives. This half-hearted compliance satisfied no one. It was insufficient to achieve Hitler's objective of prolonged resistance, yet it committed enough forces to the doomed position to weaken Model's ability to conduct mobile defense elsewhere. Model found himself trapped between impossible orders and military reality, trying to thread a needle that could not be threaded. And the stress of this position contributed to his eventual suicide in April 1945. The junior officers and enlisted men caught in this system often had no idea that their commanders were disobeying orders. They followed the instructions they received from their immediate superiors, unaware that those instructions contradicted directives from Berlin. This created a strange situation where soldiers might be fighting desperately to hold a position they thought was strategically vital, not knowing that their own high command had already written it off and was planning to withdraw them as soon as politically feasible. Conversely, soldiers sometimes found themselves ordered to execute attacks that even they could recognize as pointless, launched only because some general needed to demonstrate formal compliance with Hitler's orders before withdrawing. These pro forma offensives, undertaken with minimal preparation and abandoned at the first serious resistance, wasted lives and resources while accomplishing nothing except allowing commanders to report that they had attempted the ordered operation. The Soviets, observing German operations from the other side, noticed the increasing incoherence of German command decisions. They saw units that fought with desperate skill to hold one position while abandoning another almost without resistance. They observed counterattacks that seemed designed to fail, launched with insufficient forces or inadequate preparation. They noticed that German withdrawals, while still conducted with professional competence, were happening faster and more frequently than Hitler's known command philosophy would suggest. Soviet intelligence attributed this inconsistency to the breakdown of German command and control, which was partially true, but they missed the deeper story. The German commanders were engaged in a form of passive resistance against their own supreme command, trying to preserve what they could of their forces while maintaining the appearance of obedience to orders they knew were insane. In the Führer bunker, Hitler's awareness of this systematic disobedience manifested in increasingly paranoid rages. He denounced his generals as traitors and cowards, compared them unfavorably to the supposedly more fanatical SS commanders, and threatened mass reliefs and arrests. But these threats had lost their power.
There were no longer enough competent generals to replace those he might dismiss. The SS commanders, while ideologically reliable, often lacked professional military skill to conduct complex operations. And the Gestapo, while still feared, was overwhelmed trying to maintain control over a collapsing Reich and could not monitor every military decision. Hitler tried various methods to enforce obedience. He sent personal representatives to front commands to verify that orders were being followed. But these representatives either became convinced by frontline commanders that flexibility was necessary, or they sent back reports that Hitler dismissed as evidence of their own corruption by defeatist thinking. He demanded more detailed reports on tactical decisions, but this only generated more creative paperwork justifying actions already taken. He threatened to execute commanders who withdrew without permission, but actually carrying out such threats would have decimated what remained of competent military leadership. General Helmuth Krebs, serving as the last chief of the Army General Staff, found himself in the impossible position of mediating between Hitler's demands and operational reality. Krebs was a skilled staff officer, but his primary function by 1945 had become translating Hitler's fantasy directives into something resembling executable orders, and then translating field commanders' reports of what they had actually done into language that would not trigger Hitler's rage. Krebs spent his days in a strange performance of bureaucratic theater. He took Hitler's orders for counteroffensives by armies that no longer existed, transforming them into suggestions for limited spoiling attacks. He received reports from field commanders about necessary withdrawals and presented them to Hitler as tactical adjustments that preserved forces for future operations. It was exhausting, ultimately futile work, maintaining a fiction that satisfied no one, but allowed the military apparatus to continue functioning for a few more weeks. The final proof that Hitler's orders were being systematically ignored came in April 1945 as Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Hitler issued detailed directives for armies to relieve the capital, naming specific divisions that were to march to Berlin's rescue, designating routes of advance, and setting timetables. These orders were transmitted through proper channels, acknowledged by receiving commands, and then essentially ignored by the generals who understood that the forces in question either no longer existed, lacked the combat power for such operations, or would be destroyed attempting them. Hitler in the bunker moved phantom armies across his maps, issued orders to divisions that had ceased to exist weeks earlier, and planned counteroffensives that would never be launched. His staff dutifully transmitted these orders, commanders dutifully acknowledged them, and then everyone did what military reality dictated rather than what Hitler commanded. The system had reached the point where obedience was purely performative, a ritual maintained to avoid the consequences of open defiance, but no longer actually shaping battlefield decisions. When General Helmuth Weidling, commandant of Berlin's defense, tried to explain to Hitler that the forces designated for the city's relief were incapable of breaking through Soviet lines, Hitler accused him of defeatism and cowardice. When Weidling persisted, pointing out that the units in question lacked fuel, ammunition, and sufficient combat strength, Hitler dismissed these concerns as excuses. The conversation ended with Hitler reiterating his orders and Weidling leaving to do what he could with the forces actually available, rather than the phantom divisions Hitler believed existed. This disconnect between command and reality reached its logical endpoint in Hitler's final days. He issued orders from his bunker to armies that had surrendered,
demanded counterattacks from forces that had been destroyed, and raged against betrayals by subordinates who had simply acknowledged military facts he refused to accept. The commanders outside the bunker went through the motions of formal compliance while doing what was necessary to either survive a few more days or to arrange surrenders that might spare their remaining soldiers from pointless death. The tragic irony was that Hitler had created this situation himself. Through years of decisions that prioritized ideological loyalty over military competence, that punished honest reporting and rewarded sycophancy, that removed independent-minded officers and promoted yes-men, he had built a system designed to ensure absolute obedience. And in doing so, he had created a command structure where actual obedience was impossible because his orders bore no relationship to reality. The competent commanders who remained had learned that their duty to their soldiers and to Germany itself required them to disobey the Führer, whose loyalty oath they had sworn. This created a moral and professional crisis that many of them never resolved, contributing to the wave of suicides among senior German officers in the war's final weeks. They could see that Hitler's orders were leading to needless destruction. Yet they had spent careers in a system where obedience to superiors was the foundation of military virtue. Some, like General Heinrici, managed this contradiction by finding ways to disobey while maintaining the fiction of compliance, threading the needle between duty to Hitler and duty to their men. Others, like Field Marshal Model, found the contradiction unbearable and took their own lives. Still others, like Schörner, resolved it by embracing fanaticism, implementing Hitler's orders with brutal enthusiasm, regardless of their military senselessness, perhaps finding in absolute obedience a refuge from the moral complexities of command in a dying regime. For the ordinary soldiers at the receiving end of this dysfunctional command system, the result was chaos, punctuated by moments of competent tactical leadership. They might fight skillfully under officers who understood modern warfare, then find themselves committed to pointless operations ordered by commanders trying to demonstrate loyalty to a distant Führer. They might conduct professional fighting withdrawals one day, then be ordered to hold untenable positions the next. The inconsistency itself became demoralizing, contributing to the Wehrmacht's final disintegration. When Hitler finally committed suicide on April 30, 1945, he died believing that his armies had been betrayed by cowardly and disloyal generals who had failed to implement his brilliant strategies. The reality was more complex and more tragic. His orders had been ignored not primarily from disloyalty, but from the recognition that following them would have accelerated Germany's collapse and killed even more soldiers for no military purpose. The generals who disobeyed him were often trying to preserve some possibility of organized resistance, to save what could be saved, to fulfill what they saw as their duty to the men under their command. But this disobedience came far too late to matter strategically. By the time commanders were routinely ignoring Hitler's directives, in 1945, Germany had already lost the war. The systematic evasion of Hitler's directives in 1945 did not change the outcome, only the details of the final collapse. It saved some soldiers' lives, preserved some units for a few extra days, delayed some tactical defeats by hours or days. But it could not prevent the Reich's destruction. It could not undo years of strategic errors and criminal policies. It could not restore armies that had been bled white in campaigns launched on Hitler's orders when those orders should have been disobeyed. In the end, the realization that his orders were being ignored was just another element of Hitler's final disillusionment, another piece of evidence that the world had refused to conform to his will. He had demanded absolute obedience and built systems to enforce it, yet in the final test, those systems had failed. His generals had found ways to preserve some autonomy, to exercise some professional judgment, to do what they thought right, even when it contradicted his commands. It was a small victory, if it could be called a victory at all, for military professionalism over totalitarian control. But it came too late, achieved too little, and cost too much to celebrate. The German officer corps had allowed itself to be corrupted by Nazism for years. They had followed Hitler into wars of aggression and campaigns of genocide. They had implemented orders that violated every principle of military honor. That in the final weeks, some commanders found the courage or desperation to quietly disobey the worst tactical orders was a minor footnote to a much larger catastrophe. The telephone line went dead as Hitler, exhausted from his tirade, slammed down the receiver in Berlin. Schörner placed his own handset back in its cradle and returned to his maps, where the arrows showing Soviet advances told the real story that no amount of orders from the Führer bunker could change. Outside, his army continued its fighting retreat, ignoring Hitler's demands to stand fast, doing what soldiers had done for centuries when commanded by leaders who had lost touch with reality. They followed the orders that made sense and found ways to avoid those that did not.